During my mother's second engagement toast, my sister stood center stage, announcing she sold my mountain cabin for $890,000 cash. Guests applauded, asking about her new SUV. No one looked at me, but I knew she had not just stolen property, she was betting her future on a lie. 10 minutes later, an underwriter walked in holding an old file, and our family's deceit began to crumble. My name is Savannah Montgomery. I am 36 years old, and tonight, I am a ghost haunting my own mother's celebration. The air inside the Grand Aspen Lodge in Cedar Hollow was thick with the scent of roasted prime rib, expensive perfume, and the kind of forced cheerfulness that always accompanied our family gatherings. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm golden glow over the 60-something guests milling about the rustic chic dining hall. It was my mother's second engagement party, a lavish affair meant to signal her triumphant return to society after my father's passing 18 months ago. But to me, the glittering room felt suffocating. Every clink of a champagne flute, every burst of laughter, felt like a betrayal. This was a night my father should have been here for. He was the foundation of this family, a foundation now being paved over by a man who wore silk ascots and talked too loudly about his golf handicap. I stood near the massive stone fireplace, nursing a glass of sparkling water, feeling entirely out of place in my dark tailored suit amidst a sea of pastel cocktail dresses and tailored tuxedos. The dull roar of conversation suddenly dropped to a hush as the sharp, piercing squeal of microphone feedback echoed through the hall. I looked up to see my older sister, Brenna Kessler, standing on the small raised dais at the front of the room. She was wearing a shimmering emerald gown that caught the light with every movement. Her blonde hair styled in effortless, expensive waves. She tapped the microphone, a radiant, predatory smile plastered across her face. "If I could have everyone's attention for just a moment," Brenna announced, her voice dripping with practiced sweetness. She waited for the final murmurs to die down. "Tonight is about celebrating Mom and Leon, of course. But since we have all of our nearest and dearest in one room, I wanted to share a little piece of family news, a victory, really, for all of us." I stiffened. The skin on the back of my neck prickled. Brenna never shared the spotlight unless it served a purpose, and that purpose was usually self-aggrandizement. "As many of you know," Brenna continued, her eyes scanning the crowd and deliberately skipping over me, "the past year and a half has been incredibly heavy for our family. We have been carrying a lot of weight, literally and figuratively, and part of that weight was the old mountain cabin up on Ravencrest Road." My heart slammed against my ribs. Black Pine Cabin, my father's sanctuary, my sanctuary. The place where my father had taught me how to chop firewood, where we had sat on the porch wrapped in thick wool blankets, drinking black coffee while the snow fell. It was the only piece of him that felt untouched by the sickness that had taken him, and untouched by the sterile, superficial world my mother and sister preferred to live in. "It was just sitting there," Brenna said, adopting a tone of faux sorrow. "An abandoned property, gathering dust, soaking up property taxes, and dragging us down into the past. Someone had to step up and make the hard choice. Someone had to be sane enough to handle it." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. The unspoken words were deafening to anyone who knew our dynamic. She was telling the room that Savannah is too emotional, that Savannah is clinging to ghosts, that Savannah is incapable of moving forward. So, I took the reins, and I am thrilled to announce that I have officially sold the family cabin for $890,000, all cash. We are closing first thing Monday morning. The room erupted. Gasps of genuine surprise turned into a wave of enthusiastic applause. People raised their glasses to her. I heard a distant cousin whistle in appreciation. From across the room, my mother, Elaine Montgomery, did not gasp. She did not look shocked. Instead, she smoothed the front of her designer dress and offered Brenna a serene, glowing smile, as if her eldest daughter had just rescued the family from a burning building rather than liquidating our father's legacy behind my back. Down in the front row of tables, Brenna's husband, Tyler Kessler, was holding up his smartphone, panning the camera across the cheering crowd before turning the lens on himself. Finally, Tyler laughed loudly over the applause, his voice carrying easily to where I stood. Someone in this family knows how to turn feelings into cold, hard cash. Say goodbye to the creepy wood paneling, babe. I gripped my glass. The ice cubes clinked softly against the crystal. My mind was racing, slicing through the shock to analyze the raw data of her announcement. $890,000, cash buyer, closing Monday morning. It was a whirlwind, Brenna was saying now, leaning into the microphone, basking in the validation. But you know how it is. Once we got into escrow, we just flew through the contingencies. The earnest money was locked in solid, and we managed to negotiate 0 buyer credits for repairs. The buyers are taking it as is. It is a completely clean break. I narrowed my eyes. Escrow, contingencies, earnest money, buyer credits. The terminology rolled off her tongue with unnatural precision. Brenna could barely balance her own checking account without calling our mother in a panic. She did not know real estate law. She did not know contract structuring. She was reciting a script. She had rehearsed this terminology for days, specifically to stand up here and fire these terms at me like bullets, to prove she was the competent one, the executive decision-maker, the adult in the room. "Oh my goodness, Brenna, that is incredible," Aunt Carol chimed in loudly, stepping out from the crowd with her hands clasped together. Aunt Carol always meant well, but she possessed the situational awareness of a brick. She turned her head, finally seeking me out in the shadows by the fireplace. "Savannah, honey, you must be so relieved, and I'm sure you are glad your share will probably be split nicely. That kind of money can really set you up." The room went dead silent. A few people awkwardly shifted their weight. All eyes darted between Brenna on the stage and me by the fire. The tension was suddenly thick enough to choke on. Brenna did not miss a beat. Her grip on the microphone tightened, her knuckles going briefly white, but her smile never wavered. "Oh, Aunt Carol, bless your heart," Brenna said quickly, her voice a shade too high, effectively answering for me before I could even draw a breath. "Do not worry about any of that. The paperwork is all done. Everything is completely taken care of. Tonight is just about looking forward." They expected a scene. I could see it in Tyler's eager eyes behind his phone camera, ready to record a viral family meltdown. I could see it in my mother's suddenly rigid posture, bracing for the embarrassment. They expected Savannah, the grieving, emotional younger sister, to snap, to scream, to cry, to throw a drink, to demand answers about an inheritance that had supposedly been settled evenly, to validate every crazy narrative Brenna had just spun about my mental state. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice. I did not defend my father's memory. Instead, I stepped forward and carefully placed my glass of sparkling water on the nearest empty cocktail table. The sharp clink of the heavy crystal against the wood was soft, but in the tense silence of the room, it sounded like a judge's gavel striking a block. I looked directly at Brenna. I kept my face entirely blank, stripping away every ounce of emotion, every trace of anger or betrayal. I simply stared at her, offering absolutely nothing. I became a mirror reflecting her own performance back at her. The silence stretched. 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15 seconds. My utter lack of reaction was a void that Brenna's ego could not handle. Her rehearsed smile began to fracture at the edges. She shifted her weight nervously from one designer stiletto to the other, to maintain her dominance over the crowd. She had to keep talking, had to fill the dead air I was forcing her to endure. "So, yes," Brenna practically shouted into the mic, her tone suddenly grating, losing its practiced smoothness. "A toast. To moving on, to letting go of the dead weight, and to Mom and Leon." She raised her empty free hand as if holding a glass, a clumsy, uncoordinated gesture that drew scattered, confused applause from the guests who just wanted the awkwardness to end. She had won the crowd, but my stillness had unsettled her carefully crafted performance. I watched Tyler lower his phone, his brow furrowed in deep disappointment that he had not captured the explosive reaction he was banking on. I turned away from the stage, my heels clicking methodically against the hardwood floor, and walked toward the heavy oak doors leading to the lodge's wraparound deck. The crisp mountain air hit my face as I stepped outside, the heavy scent of pine needles cutting through the lingering, cloying smell of the party. The deck was deserted, cloaked in the shadows of the surrounding forest. I leaned against the heavy wooden railing, looking out over the dark canopy of the valley below. I was not angry. Anger was loud and messy, and usually resulted in mistakes. What I felt was a cold, sharp, surgical clarity. Brenna thought she had outsmarted me. She thought that by forcing the sale through quickly, by ambushing me in public with an audience of our peers, she could corner me into submission. She thought the shame of causing a scene would keep me quiet until the money was securely in her account. But she had made a fatal error. She had assumed I was operating on her level of emotional reactivity. She did not realize that I spent my days working in risk management, analyzing corporate compliance, tracking invisible paper trails, and systematically dismantling people who thought they were clever enough to beat the system. She thought she was playing a family game. She did not realize she had just walked into a legal slaughterhouse. Deep in the tailored pocket of my blazer, my phone vibrated, a single, short, aggressive buzz. I pulled it out and looked at the glowing screen in the darkness. It was a text message from a contact I had saved earlier that week. Miriam Holt, the title insurance underwriter at Blue Crest Title and Escrow. I swiped the screen open. The message was brief, completely devoid of professional pleasantries, and it hit with the force of a freight train. "I think I just found what they did not want you to see." I read the words twice. The crisp night wind whipped a strand of hair across my face. A slow, chilling smile spread across my lips. Brenna was right about one thing tonight. The paperwork was definitely going to speak for itself. Monday morning was going to be an absolute bloodbath, and I was not even going to have to raise my voice. 18 months ago, the world shrank to the dimensions of a sterile hospital room, measured out in the rhythmic, synthetic beeps of cardiac monitors and the sharp scent of antiseptic. Heart disease is a methodical thief. It sneaks in quietly, stealing a man's stamina first, then his breath, and finally his independence. But it was the lung complications that acted as the brutal enforcer, tearing away my father's remaining strength with agonizing slowness. Grant Montgomery, a man who had once built retaining walls with his bare hands and hiked the jagged trails of the local mountains without breaking a sweat, was reduced to a fragile silhouette tangled in plastic tubing. During those final, harrowing months, our family fractured along its natural fault lines. I became the project manager of his decline. I was the one navigating my sedan through blinding, whiteout snowstorms on Interstate 70 just to get him to his pulmonologist on time. I memorized the complex schedules of his medications, counting out exactly 22 different pills every morning and every night. I spent countless evenings contorted into agonizing shapes on vinyl hospital waiting room chairs, my laptop glowing in the dark as I battled insurance companies over thousands of dollars in denied claims. I absorbed the harsh realities of dying because someone had to keep the machinery of his care running. The rest of the family chose the luxury of distance. My mother, Elaine, loved her husband, but she loved him with a fragile, self-pitying kind of devotion. She treated his terminal illness as a personal affront to her comfortable lifestyle. She would sit by his bed for 20 minutes, weep elegantly into a monogrammed handkerchief until her mascara threatened to run, and then excuse herself because the emotional toll was triggering her migraines. She needed to preserve her energy. She claimed, in truth, she simply outsourced the grim, ugly reality of death to me because she could not bear to look at it. And my sister? Brenna possessed a flawless, predatory sixth sense for an audience. She would breeze into the oncology ward, smelling of expensive dry shampoo and vanilla latte right at the exact moment the attending physician was making rounds. She would perch on the edge of his bed, hold his bruised, IV-scarred hand, and snap a perfectly angled photograph. Within 10 minutes, that photo would be online, draped in a warm vintage filter, accompanied by paragraphs of performative poetry about the unbreakable bond between a father and his eldest daughter. She harvested his tragedy for social currency. But the moment the doctor left the room, the moment his breathing grew ragged or a nurse needed help adjusting his position, Brenna suddenly remembered an urgent conference call she could not miss. She was a ghost when the heavy lifting was required, but the star of the show when the cameras were rolling. Exactly 30 days before his heart finally gave out, Dad insisted on one last drive up to Ravencrest Road. I told him it was entirely reckless. He was heavily tethered to a portable oxygen tank, his breaths rattling in his chest like dry autumn leaves scraping across pavement. But he set his jaw in that familiar stubborn line, a look that meant arguing with him was a complete waste of breath. I loaded his tank into the trunk, and we drove the winding, steep grade in total silence. We parked and managed the slow, agonizing walk to the wraparound porch of the black pine cabin. The mountain air was biting, carrying the sharp scent of pine sap and impending snow. He leaned heavily on his aluminum cane, staring out at the dense tree line and the steep drop of the valley below. He did not look at me when he finally spoke. His voice was a thin, gravelly wheeze, but the authority behind it was absolute. "This place," he said, tapping the rubber tip of his cane against the solid oak floorboards. "It is not for those who come to take up space. It is for the one who knows how to keep a roof standing." He did not elaborate. He did not hand me a neatly notarized deed or explain the intricate mechanics of property law. He was a man who always kept his cards pressed tightly to his chest until the final hand was dealt. But as we prepared to leave, he gripped my forearm with a strength that surprised me. His eyes, usually clouded by a heavy haze of morphine, were piercingly clear. "Savannah," he whispered, the effort costing him a coughing fit that I had to wait out. "If there ever comes a day when someone is in a rush to sell this cabin, do not argue with them at the dinner table. Let the files do the talking." I did not fully understand the gravity of that warning until the week after his funeral. The house was a chaotic circus of delivered casseroles, wilting floral arrangements, and neighbors offering hollow sympathies. Needing a moment of quiet, I retreated to his downstairs study, the room that forever smelled of aged paper, leather bindings, and his favorite pipe tobacco. The moment I crossed the threshold, my stomach plummeted. The room had been sterilized. The comfortable clutter of his life was gone. Most glaringly, the heavy gray metal document box he had always kept wedged in the back of the bottom right desk drawer was missing. There were fresh, parallel scratch marks on the hardwood floor where it had been hastily dragged out, within 48 hours of him being lowered into the earth. Brenna was already spinning a brand new family mythology. She sat casually at the kitchen island, sipping a green smoothie, dropping carefully constructed phrases into every conversation. She would sigh heavily and say, "Dad always told me he wanted us to split everything straight down the middle, 50-50, to keep the peace." It was a brilliant, deeply insidious gaslighting campaign, executed with terrifying efficiency. For over a year, I tore through everything trying to find proof of his intentions. I scoured his old filing cabinets. I called his former golf buddies. I requested archived bank statements. I looked under floorboards and behind bookshelves. I knew, with absolute certainty, that he had left something behind to protect me, something to ensure the cabin remained safe. But without the original paperwork, I became the family pariah. I was transformed into the bitter, unstable younger sister clinging to a desperate fantasy. When I brought up his promises regarding the cabin, Elaine would dramatically rub her temples, complaining that my grief was making me aggressive. Brenna would look at me with large, performative eyes full of fake pity, telling our relatives that I was simply having a harder time accepting reality than she was. For 18 grueling months, I was treated like a delusional woman who had invented a secret inheritance just to cope with a profound loss. They weaponized my dedication to him, twisting my months of caregiving into proof of an unhealthy, obsessive attachment. Standing on the lodge deck tonight, staring out into the freezing dark, the suffocating truth of it all finally settled over me, heavy and suffocating like a lead blanket. What Brenna had just done in front of all those people was not merely an act of financial desperation. Yes, she needed the money. I knew Tyler's business was hemorrhaging cash, and the $890,000 was the life raft they desperately needed to maintain their country club facade. But the money was just the tangible prize. The real victory, the profound psychological win that Brenna craved far more than the cash, was the total erasure of history. By successfully liquidating the property and forcing me to accept a split of the proceeds, she was pouring concrete over the one undeniable truth our family absolutely refused to acknowledge. At the very end of his life, when the social masks finally slipped off and the eager audience went home, my father knew exactly who his daughters were. He knew Brenna was a taker, someone who would strip mine his legacy to fund a car payment, and he trusted me to be the keeper. She was not just stealing a piece of prime real estate on Ravencrest Road. She was attempting to permanently bury the very last living memory of his faith in me. If she closed on Monday morning, the narrative would be set in stone forever. She would be the pragmatic savior, and I would be the hysterical spinster who had to be dragged into the future. She wanted to rewrite the past so she could comfortably own the future. But she had forgotten the one rule my father had given me. She had assumed that because the metal box was gone, the paper trail was dead. She had underestimated the stubborn endurance of a well-buried file, and she had entirely underestimated me. At Atlas Meridian Compliance, my official job title is Senior Risk Analyst, but what I actually do is hunt. I spend 50 hours a week tracking phantom assets through complex shell corporations, dismantling fabricated revenue streams, and identifying the exact moment a desperate executive decides to cross the line from creative accounting into federal wire fraud. I am trained to look past the confident smiles and the glossy presentations to find the negative space where the truth is hiding. My sister and my mother had spent the last year and a half treating me like a fragile, grieving daughter who could barely tie her own shoes. They completely forgot that I make my living dissecting the lies of people much smarter and much more ruthless than they could ever hope to be. The first undeniable red flag had materialized 3 weeks before tonight's engagement party. The annual property tax assessment for the mountain property was traditionally mailed out in early March. It was a bill I usually handled on my father's behalf, but this year, it never arrived at his old residential address. I did not call my mother to ask about it. Instead, I logged directly into the county assessor's digital public portal. The county assessor's database is an unfeeling ledger of truth if you know how to read the metadata. I pulled up the property identification number and checked the change log. Someone had submitted a formal change of address form on the 12th of November. The official tax notices were being quietly diverted to a generic post office box located in a dilapidated strip mall 3 towns over. That was the thread. I grabbed it and started pulling. A targeted web search of the property address immediately brought up the active real estate listing. It had been on the market for exactly 4 days. Seeing the photographs on my computer monitor made my stomach turn cold. They had hired a staging company to completely erase him. His heavy, hand-carved rocking chair and vintage snowshoes were gone, replaced by sterile, mass-produced farmhouse decor and neutral gray area rugs. But it was the broker's property description that truly caught my eye. The text proudly boasted that the property was a rare, free and clear inherited asset, primed for an immediate, hassle-free transfer. That specific phrase was a massive, glaring liability. I knew for an absolute fact that my father had spent his final 2 years actively restructuring his entire financial portfolio. He despised the probate courts. He had watched his own parents' estate get devoured by legal fees when he was a young man, and he swore he would never let a judge dictate the fate of his hard work. He would never, under any circumstances, leave his most prized possession floating free and clear in a simple, contestable will. Then I looked at the listing agent representing my sister. It was not one of the premier luxury agencies in Cedar Hollow. It was a small-time strip mall broker who specialized in high-volume, low-scrutiny property flips. Furthermore, the timeline they were advertising was aggressively condensed. They were pushing for a 14-day cash close. In the world of commercial real estate and complex residential transfers, an artificially rushed closing is the universal symptom of a seller who is utterly terrified of a comprehensive title search. They wanted the funds wired and cleared before any underwriter had the necessary time to look closely at the county archives. Most people in my position would have panicked. They would have called the police immediately, or they would have hired a loud, aggressive attorney to send a cease and desist letter threatening a lawsuit, but involving law enforcement too early is a rookie mistake. If I blew the whistle now, local police would likely write it off as a messy civil dispute between squabbling siblings. Even worse, warning a fraudster only teaches them how to hide their tracks more effectively. I did not want Brenna to pause, regroup, and destroy evidence. I wanted her to feel completely safe. I wanted her to commit. So, I became a ghost in the machine. I set up automated digital alerts for any changes to the listing status. I downloaded every single iteration of the marketing brochure. I took high-resolution screenshots of the property listing across 5 different syndication platforms. I saved the broker's promotional emails to a secure, encrypted offline drive. I even started logging the exact timestamps of Brenna's casual mentions of an impending financial windfall in our family group chat. I was quietly building an airtight, chronological chain of evidence that no defense attorney could ever dismantle. Her true motive fully crystallized when I uncovered Tyler's recent activities. Tyler is a man who wears expensive cologne to mask the distinct scent of his own professional failures. I ran into a mutual acquaintance at a coffee shop downtown a few days ago. Tyler had been running his mouth after a few expensive bourbons. His boutique property management business, Summit Nest Stays, had been bleeding capital for 24 months straight. Yet, he had casually bragged to this acquaintance that right after their upcoming real estate deal finalized, his company was acquiring long-term leases on 3 new luxury properties. He was actively spending a phantom $890,000. They were drowning in toxic debt, and they were using my father's legacy as an illegal, last-minute life raft to save their country club facade. I knew then that the most dangerous, yet most effective strategy was to let them walk right up to the edge of the cliff. If I let Brenna sign the final closing disclosures, if I let her legally declare herself the sole owner under penalty of perjury to a federally insured financial institution, she would cross the threshold from a greedy, manipulative sister into a documented felon. But to spring the trap perfectly, I needed an inside operative. I needed someone whose literal job was to stop bad transactions dead in their tracks. 4 days ago, I drafted a highly sterile, heavily documented email to Bluecrest Title and Escrow, the firm handling the earnest money and the title insurance for the buyers. I bypassed the front desk entirely and addressed my correspondence directly to the senior underwriter assigned to the file, a woman named Miriam Holt. I did not write an emotional plea about my stolen inheritance. Underwriters do not care about family drama. They care about risk exposure. I wrote a clinical risk assessment. I identified myself formally as an interested party and politely suggested that a standard 30-year title search might be insufficient for this specific parcel. I deliberately did not use the word fraud. Instead, I recommended looking into a potential chain of title discontinuity involving unrecorded trust documents during the specific 18-month window of my father's medical decline. I gave Miriam just enough thread to pull. Underwriters are naturally suspicious, meticulous creatures. If you tell them a file is perfectly clean, they will scrub it until it bleeds just to prove you wrong. I knew Miriam would dig into the archives, and I knew exactly what she was going to find. Standing on the deck in the freezing mountain air, clutching my phone with Miriam's explosive text message glowing on the screen, I made a silent vow. My mother and sister had spent over a year painting me as the volatile, overly emotional weak link of the family. They wanted me to break down tonight. They wanted me to scream and throw a tantrum so they could justify locking me out of the estate entirely, but I was not going to give them a single tear, and I was not going to raise my voice. I was going to let the relentless, uncaring machinery of the legal system do the screaming for me. I would take my calmness, forge it into a blade, and watch them blindly bleed themselves dry on the edge of it. To understand the sheer velocity of my sister's betrayal, You have to look past the surface-level sibling rivalry and examine the terrifying mathematics of her daily life. Brenna was not selling our father's sanctuary simply out of spite or some deep-seated desire to see me lose. She was operating from a place of sheer, unadulterated financial panic. For the past 2 years, Tyler's boutique property management venture, Summit Nest Stays, had been experiencing a catastrophic series of failures. He had over-leveraged their personal assets to acquire short-term rental properties, just as the local tourism market experienced a massive, unforeseen correction. They were effectively drowning in a sea of toxic debt, scrambling to maintain the illusion of an upscale suburban lifestyle while their bank accounts bled dry. Through my own discreet channels, I had pieced together the desperate puzzle of their recent expenditures. Believing that the $890,000 from the cabin sale was an absolute certainty, Brenna and Tyler had completely abandoned all financial restraint. They had recently taken out a massive, high-interest bridge loan from one of Tyler's former college fraternity brothers, promising to repay the principal in full by the end of the month. Worse, they had just signed a 5-year commercial lease for a highly visible, incredibly expensive downtown office space to supposedly rebrand the failing company. To top it all off, they had brazenly placed a $10,000 non-refundable cash deposit on a custom-ordered luxury hybrid sport utility vehicle. They had built a massive, precarious house of cards, and Monday's closing was the only thing preventing the entire structure from collapsing and burying them in bankruptcy. My mother, of course, had her own selfish motivations for looking the other way. Elaine was entirely consumed by her upcoming nuptials to Leon Harrow. Leon was a retired, wealthy, and meticulously organized man who despised drama of any kind. He wanted a partner who came from a stable, well-adjusted family free of messy legal entanglements or unresolved estate disputes. Elaine was terrified that if Leon caught even a slight whiff of conflict regarding my father's assets, he would quietly back out of the marriage. Brenna, sensing this vulnerability, had played our mother flawlessly. I later learned that Brenna had taken Elaine out for expensive lunches, subtly feeding her a toxic narrative. She convinced our mother that allowing me to retain ownership of the property would be a monumental mistake. Brenna argued that I would simply let the cabin rot in sentimentality, turning it into a morbid, decaying shrine to a dead man. Selling it, she promised, was the only clean, pragmatic way to close the book on our grief and allow the family to step into a bright, financially secure new chapter. Elaine bought the lie wholesale because it offered her the path of least resistance. The sheer audacity of Brenna's greed, however, extended far beyond commercial leases and new cars. While digging through local municipal filings a week ago, I stumbled upon a recently approved construction permit attached to Brenna's primary residence. She had officially retained one of the most expensive remodeling contractors in the county to completely gut and expand her master suite and kitchen. I managed to view the preliminary lien waiver documents filed with the city. Brenna had already wired a $50,000 advance payment to the builder just to secure her spot on their autumn construction schedule. She was treating my father's legacy like a personal, unlimited line of credit, casually drawing down funds she did not legally possess to buy imported marble countertops and custom cabinetry. But the most sickening revelation of all came when I finally pierced the corporate veil of the buyer's limited liability company. Brenna had gleefully bragged to our extended relatives that she had found a sweet, wealthy family from the city who wanted a quiet place for weekend getaways. That was a complete and utter fabrication. The corporate entity purchasing the property was actually controlled by a pair of aggressive, high-net-worth real estate investors. These were developers who specialized in acquiring rustic land, bulldozing the existing structures, and building exclusive high-density wellness retreats for wealthy tourists. They were not paying nearly $1 million for the hand-hewn cedar logs or the cozy stone fireplace. They were paying for the topography. The black pine cabin sat on a highly coveted parcel that included unobstructed ridgeline views and, most importantly, grandfathered access to an independent, high-yield subterranean water source. Brenna understood exactly what she was doing. She knew she was not just selling a nostalgic vacation home. She was liquidating a highly strategic, incredibly valuable piece of land that our father had spent decades trying to protect from commercial exploitation. The true devastating weight of what was about to be lost had been handed to me just 3 days before the engagement party. I was standing in the lumber aisle of the local hardware store when I felt a heavy, calloused hand drop onto my shoulder. It was Reese Talbot. Reese was one of my father's oldest friends, a retired land surveyor who knew the geographic contours and hidden property lines of Cedar Hollow better than anyone alive. He looked around nervously, ensuring no one else was in the aisle, before shoving a battered, cylindrical plastic map tube into my hands. His voice was a tight, raspy whisper. He told me that during the last summer my father was mobile. Before the oxygen tanks became permanent, they had spent weeks quietly walking the boundary lines of the Ravencrest property. He said my father was working on something highly specific, something designed to lock the land down permanently so it could never be subdivided or commercialized. Reese told me to look closely at the rolled-up topographic maps inside the tube, specifically the margins where my father had scribbled dense, frantic notes regarding something called Schedule C. I spent that entire night sitting on my living room floor, unrolling those massive maps and tracing my father's faded architectural handwriting. It was a complex matrix of watershed protections and strict land use restrictions. Right next to the coordinates for the natural spring, he had repeatedly written the words irrevocable conservation rights. Staring out at the dark tree line from the lodge deck, the final, horrifying puzzle piece clicked into place, sending a shard of ice straight through my chest. If Brenna successfully closed this transaction on Monday morning, the developers would not just tear down the cabin to build their luxury retreat. They would use their massive legal resources to permanently extinguish those pending conservation easements before they could ever be fully legally enforced. They would pave over the natural springs, bulldoze the ancient pine stands, and shatter the delicate ecological sanctuary my father had bled to preserve. I realized then that this was no longer just a battle over stolen inheritance money or petty family politics. This transaction was infinitely more dangerous than a simple real estate fraud. If I allowed that deed to transfer, Brenna would not just be robbing me of a house. She would be permanently wiping out every single protective right attached to that mountain, erasing the very soul of the land my father had explicitly trusted me to defend. Miriam Holt did not survive 22 years in the cutthroat title insurance industry by trusting the inherent goodness of human nature. She survived by operating under the baseline assumption that every single party involved in a high-value real estate transaction was actively attempting to deceive her. In her meticulous, cynical world, a file that looked flawlessly clean was often the most dangerous kind. Amateur fraudsters always overcompensate. They bleach the paperwork so thoroughly, removing every minor discrepancy and typical administrative snag, that the stark absence of normal, messy human error becomes the primary evidence of foul play. When I had initially flagged the Ravencrest parcel for an elevated review 4 days ago, I knew exactly what kind of predator I was unleashing on my sister's manufactured narrative. I was handing the file to a bloodhound who lived for the thrill of the hunt. The initial title commitment that Brenna's discount broker had ordered looked perfectly standard on the surface. It showed a straightforward transfer from a deceased owner to an heir, supported by a neatly packaged probate summary. But Miriam had a specific, rigid methodology. She always read the chronological timeline of a property before she even looked at the actual deeds. While reviewing the county's historical ledger for the land, she noticed a bizarre, silent vacuum in the public record. There was a conspicuous blank space stretching across a very specific 12-month window. That timeline perfectly aligned with the year my father's medical condition had plummeted the fastest. During a critical period when a wealthy man with complex, sprawling assets should have been actively filing medical power of attorney updates, recording new liens, or shifting liabilities to protect his estate. The county index for his name went completely and unnaturally dark. To a seasoned underwriter, that kind of total silence was deafening. It meant the paperwork existed, but it was being deliberately kept off the public radar. The entire thread finally started to unravel over a single, seemingly insignificant typographical error. To establish her sole uncontested right to sell the property, Brenna had submitted a sworn affidavit of heirship to the title company. In the attached legal description of the land, the paralegal who drafted Brenna's rushed paperwork had transcribed a subdivision symbol as a standard section marker. It was a microscopic mistake, a simple slip of a pinky finger on a computer keyboard. However, in the rigid mechanics of property law, that tiny keystroke meant the legal description on Brenna's new deed did not perfectly mirror the original surveyor's plat from 45 years ago. That microscopic mismatch was the only excuse Miriam needed. It forced her to completely bypass the digital summary provided by the broker and manually pull the raw scanned archival images from the county recorder's basement database. She stopped searching for Grant Montgomery altogether. Instead, she started running complex wildcard searches. She ran variations of the specific parcel identification number, cross-referencing the adjacent boundary lines and utility easements. That was when she hit the tripwire. A document had indeed been scanned and logged into the county system roughly 14 months before my father died, but it had been disastrously misindexed by an overworked, careless county clerk. Instead of being filed under his legal last name, Montgomery, the document had been categorized under his middle name, Arthur. It was a bureaucratic ghost. Unless a title searcher was specifically looking for a needle in a haystack and knew exactly what metallic alloy that needle was made of, the document was practically invisible to a standard background check. Miriam pulled the high-resolution image file and sent a secure, encrypted link directly to my phone. I stood in the freezing wind on the lodge deck, my breath pluming in the dark air, and opened the document. It was a memorandum of irrevocable land trust. The document bore the unmistakable, raised, and embossed seal of the county recorder. At the bottom of the second page was the distinct, sprawling, heavy-handed signature of my father. The property explicitly described within the boundaries of the memorandum was undeniably the Black Pine Cabin, matching the legal description down to the precise degree of the surveyor's longitude. Most crucially, the language of the memorandum indicated that this trust had never been dissolved, amended, or revoked. Yet, it had been completely and deliberately omitted from the sanitized, heavily redacted version of the probate file Brenna was currently parading around town as her golden ticket. A memorandum, however, is merely a public notice. It is not the trust itself. It serves only to outline the existence of the legal structure without revealing the private, internal mechanics. It does not state who the ultimate beneficiary is, nor does it list the specific asset protections or conservation easements attached to the land. Legally speaking, the memorandum alone was not quite enough to permanently nuke the closing on the spot. A clever, aggressive defense attorney could potentially argue it was merely an abandoned estate planning draft that my father forgot to officially void. But Miriam was not a judge. She was an underwriter. In the ruthless, highly risk-averse world of title insurance, a newly discovered memorandum was more than enough ammunition to pull the emergency brake. Miriam immediately placed a hard, non-negotiable fraud hold on the entire transaction. The escrow account containing the buyer's massive earnest money deposit was instantly frozen. The preliminary title commitment was formally suspended. The Monday morning closing, which Brenna had just triumphantly announced to a room full of 60 cheering guests, was now effectively dead on arrival. But Miriam was not finished. A fraud hold was a temporary measure, a tourniquet applied to a bleeding wound. She needed the definitive kill shot. She needed to locate the full executed trust packet. Using the unique identification number of the notary public who had stamped the memorandum, Miriam tracked the notary's employment history back to a specific branch of a local community bank. It was a small financial institution that had since been swallowed up by a massive, ruthless national banking conglomerate during a corporate merger 3 years ago. Digging deep into the digitized collateral archives of that specific merger, Miriam found a corresponding reference number. The digital ledger indicated that my father had submitted the complete, original trust binder to the bank's private wealth management division when he was aggressively restructuring his portfolio to avoid probate. That was the intense, high-stakes context behind the message currently burning a hole in my phone screen. Standing on the freezing deck, the muffled bass of the engagement party music thumping against the heavy glass doors behind me. I watched 3 more text bubbles pop up from Miriam in rapid succession. She explained that she had successfully located the specific, climate-controlled storage facility housing the acquired bank's physical archives. If the original trust packet was sitting inside that secure vault exactly where the digital ledger said it was, the situation was about to escalate far beyond a simple canceled contract. By actively signing a commercial purchase agreement, accepting contractor deposits, and swearing out an affidavit of heirship while a superseding legal trust existed, Brenna had crossed a terrifying threshold. She was no longer just a greedy sibling. She was staring down the barrel of a fully documented, multi-count felony real estate fraud indictment. The final text from Miriam was brief, clinical, and sent a rush of pure adrenaline straight through my veins. She wrote that she had an emergency, after-hours contact at the archival facility pulling the physical box right now. She needed exactly 1 hour to verify the wet ink signatures and cross-check the property exhibits against the county records. 1 hour. I slipped the phone back into the tailored pocket of my blazer and turned to face the glass doors. Inside the warm, glittering lodge, the party was reaching a fever pitch. My sister was holding court by the mahogany bar, laughing too loudly, her diamond earrings catching the chandelier light as she accepted congratulations from our wealthy relatives. My mother was beaming brightly beside her new fiancé, completely oblivious to the impending destruction of her carefully curated social image. The entire room was collectively waiting for me to walk back inside and break. They were waiting for the hysterical, grieving younger sister to finally cause a massive, ugly scene so they could completely and permanently dismiss my sanity. They had absolutely no idea that the solid ground beneath their expensive leather shoes had already opened up into a massive sinkhole. I did not need to scream. I did not need to fight them for validation. I just had to walk back into that dining room, order another glass of sparkling water, and give the guillotine exactly 60 more minutes to fall. Exactly 58 minutes later, I pushed open the heavy glass doors and stepped back into the suffocating warmth of the Grand Aspen Lodge. The party had shifted gears. The elegant string quartet had been replaced by a lively jazz playlist, and the champagne was flowing with reckless abandon. At the center of the room, my sister was vibrating with a toxic cocktail of adrenaline and expensive vodka. She had cornered a group of our wealthy aunts and uncles near the ice sculpture. When she caught sight of me re-entering the hall, a cruel spark ignited in her eyes. She could not just take her supposed victory and walk away. She needed absolute submission. She snatched a fresh flute of champagne from a passing waiter and tapped a silver dessert spoon against the crystal rim. The sharp, high-pitched ringing cut through the jazz music, demanding the room's attention for a second time. "I want to propose one more toast," Brenna announced, her voice carrying a theatrical, syrupy weight. She raised her glass high. "To the future. For the past 18 months, we have all been trapped under a very heavy, very dark shadow. But after this Monday morning, we are officially cutting the cord. I am so proud to say that I have finally freed this family from the ghost of the past." She turned her head, locking her gaze directly onto mine. The crowd shifted, following her line of sight. "It takes a lot to make the hard choices," Brenna continued, her tone patronizing, stepping closer to where I stood by the cocktail tables. "It takes a maturity that, frankly, some people just lack the courage to find. So, I think we all deserve a round of applause for doing what had to be done, for growing up." She was baiting me. She wanted me to snap, to throw my drink in her face, to scream that she was a thief. She wanted the spectacular public meltdown that would finally cement her narrative that I was unhinged. I did not flinch. I kept my posture perfectly straight. My hands relaxed by my sides and offered her a serene, empty smile. My absolute refusal to engage infuriated her. Her chest heaved. She opened her mouth to push harder, to say something truly unforgivable, but she was abruptly cut off. The double oak doors at the main entrance of the banquet hall swung open. The lodge manager, a usually composed man in a crisp tuxedo, hurried inside, looking incredibly pale and deeply uncomfortable. He practically sprinted across the hardwood floor, weaving through the bewildered guests until he reached my sister. He leaned in and whispered frantically into her ear. The room was quiet enough that I caught the ragged edge of his voice. He said someone from Bluecrest Title and Escrow was here, demanding to see her immediately regarding a catastrophic issue with her Monday morning closing. Brenna let out a sharp, derisive laugh. She rolled her eyes, playing to the crowd. "Oh, for heaven's sake, these underwriters work around the clock, do they not? It is probably just a missing signature on a disclosure form." She did not step out into the lobby. She waved her hand dismissively toward the entrance. "Well, tell them to come in. We are all family here." The manager hesitated, then nodded and signaled to the doorway. Miriam Holt stepped into the light of the crystal chandeliers. She did not look like someone arriving at a party. She looked like an executioner arriving at the gallows. She wore a sharp, charcoal gray trench coat over a tailored suit, her sensible flat silent against the floorboards. In her right hand, she gripped a thick, dark leather briefcase. Her face was a mask of pure, unadulterated professional ice. She walked straight toward Brenna, stopping a mere 5 feet away. The guests parted for her instinctively, sensing the sudden, dangerous shift in the atmosphere. "Brenna Kessler," Miriam said. Her voice was not loud, but it possessed a cold, metallic density that carried to the very back of the room. "I am the senior underwriter handling the escrow account for the Raven Crest transaction. I requested to speak with you privately in the lobby." Brenna crossed her arms, a smug, defensive smirk plastered on her face. She was completely intoxicated by her own perceived power and entirely blind to the trap closing around her ankles. "Whatever you have to say to me about my property, you can say right here in front of my family. What is the problem? Did the buyers forget to wire the rest of their earnest money?" Miriam did not blink. She did not express pity. She simply opened the brass clasps of her leather briefcase. "The buyers' funds are secure," Miriam stated flatly. "However, the transaction is dead. I have placed an immediate, non-negotiable fraud hold on the entire file, and your closing is permanently canceled." A collective gasp rippled through the 60 guests. The jazz music suddenly seemed obscenely loud in the background until the bartender frantically scrambled to mute the sound system. Brenna's smirk vanished, replaced by a deep, ugly flush of red creeping up her neck. "Excuse me? You cannot cancel my closing. You have absolutely no right. My broker said the title was free and clear." "Your broker ran a surface-level search and failed to perform due diligence," Miriam countered, her tone surgical and merciless. She pulled a thick stack of paper from her briefcase. 45 minutes ago, a supplemental deep archive title search confirmed that the property located on Raven Crest Road does not belong to the estate of Grant Montgomery, nor does it belong to you. The cabin was legally transferred into the Juniper Ridge Irrevocable Land Trust exactly 14 months prior to your father's passing. Miriam turned slightly, her cold eyes sweeping the room until they landed on me. "And the sole, legal beneficiary of that trust is Savannah Montgomery." The silence that slammed into the banquet hall was absolute. It was the sound of an entire family's collective delusion shattering against a concrete floor. "That is a lie!" Brenna shrieked, her voice cracking, the polished socialite facade completely disintegrating. She pointed a trembling finger at Miriam. "That is a fabricated document. She is making this up. Savannah put you up to this, did she not? How much is she paying you to ruin my night?" From the front table, my mother leaped to her feet. Her face was ashen, her hands clutching her pearl necklace as if she were suffocating. "Now, wait just 1 minute," Elaine stammered, her voice shaking violently. "Grant would never do something like that. He would never hide an asset like that without telling his family. We would have known." Miriam Holt did not argue with hysterical people. She operated entirely on documented facts. Without breaking eye contact with my mother, she stepped forward and handed the top copy of the stapled packet directly to Brenna, then handed a second copy to Elaine and a third to Tyler, who was staring at the paper as if it were a venomous snake. "I do not deal in emotions. Mrs. Montgomery, I deal in recorded chain of title," Miriam said, her voice dropping an octave, carrying the terrifying weight of federal compliance. "What you are holding is a certified copy of the Memorandum of Trust. Please direct your attention to the second page. You will find the official county recorder's embossed seal, the precise filing date, and the assigned indexing number. Below that, you will find the exact legal description of the land, which matches your fraudulent real estate listing character for character. Most importantly, you will find the wet ink signature of Grant Arthur Montgomery, verified against his state identification records." I watched my sister's eyes dart wildly across the page. I watched the blood completely drain from her face as she read our father's distinct, heavy-handed signature. The paper in her hands began to shake violently. Tyler grabbed the document from her, his jaw dropping open as the catastrophic financial reality of their situation hit him like a physical blow. Around the room, the whispers began. They started soft, like dry leaves rustling in the wind, and quickly swelled into an undeniable chorus of shock. Aunts, uncles, and family friends were staring at Brenna with a mixture of horror and profound disgust. The pieces were locking together in real time in the minds of 60 different people. They suddenly realized I had never been crazy. I had never been clinging to a delusion. For 18 months, I had been telling the exact truth, and the family had actively participated in a coordinated campaign to silence me, institutionalize my grief, and steal my inheritance. Brenna looked completely cornered. She opened her mouth, trying to formulate another lie, another spin, but there was nowhere left to run. The paper in her hand was an indestructible wall. "This is just a memorandum," Brenna choked out, her voice barely a whisper, desperately clinging to a legal technicality she barely understood. "It does not prove she gets the house. It just proves he thought about it." Miriam stepped back, snapping her leather briefcase shut. The metallic click echoed sharply in the quiet room. "You are correct. That is merely the summary notice," Miriam replied, her eyes narrowing into a lethal glare. "The full, executed trust packet, complete with the schedule of assets and the anti-alienation clauses, is currently being pulled from a secure banking archive downtown by an emergency courier. We will have it in our possession by tomorrow morning." Miriam turned toward the exit, pausing just long enough to deliver the final, devastating blow over her shoulder. "And once those final signatures are verified at 9 o'clock tomorrow morning, my office will be legally obligated to submit a comprehensive real estate fraud report to the State Attorney General's office. Have a wonderful evening, ladies." By 9 o'clock the next morning, the adrenaline of the previous night had completely evaporated, replaced by the sterile, freezing reality of a downtown law firm. The air in Noah Pritchard's corner office smelled of expensive dark roast coffee and fresh laser printer ink. Noah, my attorney, had been pacing his office since dawn, waiting for the bonded courier to arrive from the secured banking archive. He was a man who lived for paper trails, a legal architect who specialized in dismantling fraudulent estates with surgical precision. When his receptionist finally walked in carrying a massive, heavy-duty manila envelope sealed with red tamper-evident tape, Noah did not offer a polite greeting. He simply took the package, locked his office door, and ushered me toward the massive mahogany conference table. He took a silver letter opener and sliced through the tape. With a heavy thud, he dumped the contents onto the polished wood. The Juniper Ridge Irrevocable Land Trust was no longer a theoretical ghost or a single-page county memorandum. It was a 120-page physical reality, bound in thick leather, dripping with notary stamps, and overflowing with undeniable legal authority. Noah methodically flipped through the first several sections, his eyes scanning the dense legalese with terrifying speed. He pulled out the signature pages first, verifying the wet ink against my father's known handwriting samples. Then, He slid the schedule of assets across the table toward me. It was all there, itemized with a ruthless, paranoid level of detail. The trust did not just cover the physical structure of the Black Pine cabin. My father had legally insulated the entire micro-ecosystem. The subterranean water rights, the private gravel access road, the mineral rights, and the comprehensive conservation easement were all securely locked inside the trust wrapper. This property had never been a part of his general probate estate. It was completely fenced off from the standard 50-50 division of assets that my sister had been using to justify her actions. "Look at this," Noah said, his voice dropping into a low, predatory register. He tapped his index finger against a densely packed paragraph buried deep in Section 4. "Your father did not just leave you a house. He built you a fortress. This is one of the most aggressive anti-alienation clauses I have seen in 20 years of practice." I leaned over the table, reading the text. My father had clearly anticipated a raid. The clause explicitly and unequivocally stated that any unauthorized individual attempting to sell, mortgage, encumber, or fraudulently misrepresent ownership of the trust property would be in direct violation of the settler's intent. Crucially, it opened the door for immediate civil penalties, making the offending party personally liable for all resulting legal fees and punitive damages. Brenna had not just listed a house she did not own. She had actively triggered a financial landmine that was engineered to destroy her. But the impenetrable legal armor was not what ultimately broke my composure. Tucked neatly behind the final exhibit, resting inside a plain white envelope, was a personal addendum. It was addressed to me. I reached out with trembling fingers and broke the wax seal. Inside was a single sheet of heavy stationery, covered in my father's unmistakable, sloping handwriting. He had written it during his final lucid weeks, and the ink seemed to carry the echo of his raspy voice. He did not write about property taxes, escrow accounts, or land values. He wrote about the long, terrifying nights in the oncology ward. He wrote that the mountain, and the peace it provided, belonged exclusively to the one who stayed when things got undeniably ugly and overwhelmingly expensive. He explicitly named my sister in the very next paragraph. He wrote that he knew exactly how Brenna operated. He feared she would look at the ancient timber and the hand-carved stone and see nothing but a fast ledger entry, a quick liquidation to plug the endless holes of her own impulsive, reckless financial decisions. He knew her character was fundamentally hollow, and he had spent his dying days ensuring her greed could never touch his sanctuary. While I was silently absorbing the sheer, crushing weight of my father's foresight, Noah had moved on. He was cross-referencing the timeline of the trust against the recent, fraudulent paperwork Brenna had filed to execute her quick cash sale. "Savannah, put the letter down and look at the screen," Noah commanded, turning his laptop toward me. He had pulled up the digital copy of the sworn affidavit of heirship that Brenna had submitted to her discount real estate broker, the document she used to claim she was the sole legal owner. Right next to it, Noah opened a separate browser window displaying the state registry logs for public notaries. "Your sister's paralegal made a fatal error," Noah explained, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Notice the notary stamp on Brenna's affidavit. It claims the document was legally sworn and signed at 2 p.m. on a Tuesday, roughly 3 weeks ago. Now, look at the state registry log for that specific notary public." I traced the line of data across the screen. The state records proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that the specific notary whose stamp appeared on the affidavit had been on a recorded medical leave of absence during that entire week. The stamp had been used illegally, likely by an unlicensed assistant in a rush to push the paperwork through. "The document is not just legally inaccurate," Noah stated, a cold smile touching the corners of his mouth. "It is either maliciously backdated or an outright forgery, both of which elevate this from a civil dispute directly into felony territory." But the trail of deceit grew even darker and far more personal when Noah pulled out a stack of subpoenaed United States Postal Service forwarding records. I had previously assumed that the property tax bills had been diverted just a few weeks ago, right around the time the listing went live online. I was completely wrong. Noah laid the postal logs over the forged affidavit. The official mail diversion request had been filed merely 3 weeks after we buried my father. For over a year, the county tax assessments, the hazard insurance renewals, and every single piece of official municipal correspondence regarding the Black Pine cabin had been systematically redirected away from the family home and straight into Brenna's private commercial post office box. The timeline hit me with the force of a physical blow to the chest. The air in the room suddenly felt incredibly thin. This meant my mother had to have known. Elaine Montgomery managed the primary residential mailbox. She was meticulous about the household finances, tracking every utility bill and subscription. She absolutely would have noticed the sudden, glaring absence of the massive annual property tax bill for the mountain property. She would have noticed the insurance premium notices disappearing into thin air. She did not just look the other way out of some misguided, weak-willed desire to keep the peace. She had actively maintained a deliberate wall of silence to give Brenna the cover she needed to execute a slow, methodical theft over the course of 18 months. The psychological realization was entirely suffocating. I had spent the last year and a half trying to defend my sanity against what I thought were spontaneous acts of sibling rivalry and a grieving mother's denial. But there was absolutely nothing spontaneous about this betrayal. It was a highly calculated, cold-blooded conspiracy drafted while the dirt on my father's grave was still fresh. Every single time my mother had dramatically rolled her eyes at my grief, every single time Brenna had loudly called me delusional at a family holiday dinner, they both knew the exact truth. They had actively weaponized my mourning to keep me emotionally off balance while they quietly picked the locks on my inheritance. I sat back heavily in the leather chair, staring at the mountain of indisputable evidence spread across the conference table. My hands were shaking, but not from sorrow. The sadness had finally burned away, leaving behind a terrifying, crystalline rage. I looked up at Noah. He was watching me carefully, his hands folded neatly over the forged affidavit. He understood exactly what was happening behind my eyes. He leaned forward, resting his forearms on the table, and delivered the absolute, unvarnished truth. "Savannah, you need to listen to me very carefully," Noah said, his voice devoid of any comforting warmth. "From this exact second forward, you have to surgically remove every single ounce of pity you hold for your mother and your sister. They did not afford you any mercy, and you cannot afford to give them any now." He tapped his hand against the thick leather binder of the trust. "With this packet sitting between us, the dynamic has completely shifted." Noah concluded, "We are no longer dealing with a tragic misunderstanding. This is no longer a messy family drama about hurt feelings and mismatched memories. We are now preparing for a brutal, unyielding war of evidence. And when the hammer drops, the casualties are going to be entirely their own fault. The gears of the justice system do not grind with sudden, dramatic explosions. They turn with the terrifying, silent precision of a hydraulic press." Within 24 hours of our meeting, Noah Pritchard unleashed a barrage of legal filings that effectively paralyzed my sister's entire existence. He started by marching into the county courthouse and filing an emergency ex parte injunction, freezing any and all potential transfers, liens, or encumbrances related to the Ravencrest property. But Noah did not stop at the courthouse steps. He drafted a series of aggressive litigation hold and evidence preservation notices, dispatching them via certified mail and process servers to everyone within Brenna's blast radius. The escrow company, the discount real estate broker, the corporate buyers, and even the luxury remodeling contractor who had taken my sister's premature deposit all received legally binding orders to immediately freeze their communications and retain every single digital and physical record connected to Brenna Kessler. The corporate developers who had attempted to purchase the cabin were not the type of people who quietly accepted a busted deal. They were ruthless, well-funded predators who had just realized they had been played by an amateur. By Wednesday afternoon, their legal team filed a massive civil suit against Brenna and Tyler for fraudulent misrepresentation and breach of contract. They were not merely asking for their earnest money back. Those funds were already permanently trapped in Miriam Holt's frozen escrow account. The developers demanded full restitution for their extensive due diligence costs. They submitted heavily itemized invoices for topographic surveyors, environmental impact consultants, and high-end architectural renderings. Furthermore, they aggressively pursued damages for lost opportunity costs, arguing that by tying up their capital in Brenna's fraudulent listing, they had completely missed the closing window on a separate, highly lucrative commercial parcel on the other side of the valley. The financial damages they sought easily eclipsed $250,000. Faced with the terrifying prospect of losing their real estate license and being dragged into a massive fraud conspiracy, Brenna's discount broker immediately panicked and flipped to protect themselves. In a desperate bid to secure professional immunity, the broker's attorney voluntarily surrendered their entire internal communication log to Noah. Reading through those transcripts was like watching a slow-motion car crash. Brenna had been incredibly reckless. In multiple text messages and late-night emails, she had explicitly urged the broker to push the closing timeline forward, complaining in writing that the title history was going to be incredibly difficult to explain if anyone started digging into the estate records too closely. She had practically handed Noah a signed confession, proving that her actions were not the result of a simple paperwork misunderstanding, but rather a calculated, premeditated effort to outrun the truth. The contagion of her fraud rapidly infected Tyler's already failing business. Cedar Hollow is a small, insular community, where rumors of financial impropriety spread faster than a mountain wildfire. The moment the lawsuit from the developers hit the public docket, the few remaining private investors propping up Summit nest stays immediately pulled their backing. Without that crucial influx of capital, Tyler had absolutely no cash flow to cover the exorbitant, short-term bridge loans he had taken out from his wealthy friends. The predatory interest rates on those loans began compounding daily, transforming their already precarious financial situation into a catastrophic death spiral. Then came the final, humiliating blow to their domestic facade. The high-end contractor remodeling their primary residence received Noah's preservation notice and instantly realized his wealthy clients were suddenly radioactive. He immediately halted all demolition work on Brenna's house, leaving her kitchen and master suite exposed down to the bare wooden studs. Worse, he hit her with a hard, uncompromising demand for an additional $40,000 to cover the cost of imported marble slabs and custom cabinetry that had already been ordered and fabricated specifically for her home. He threatened to place a mechanic's lien on her primary residence by the end of the week if the invoice was not settled in full. Brenna was completely trapped, bleeding cash from every conceivable artery, with zero incoming revenue to stop the hemorrhage. It was in the dead center of this spectacular multi-front collapse that my phone finally rang. The caller identification displayed my mother's name. I let it ring 4 times, staring at the glowing screen on my desk, before I finally swiped to answer. I did not offer a greeting. Elaine's voice was brittle, trembling with a pathetic mixture of manufactured warmth and barely concealed panic. "Savannah, sweetheart," she began, using a pet name she had not uttered since I was in high school. "We really need to sit down and talk about this. Just you and me, mother to daughter. Things have gotten so entirely out of hand, and these lawyers are just making everything so ugly and aggressive." She paused, waiting for me to soften, waiting for the familiar, deeply ingrained family guilt to take over. When I offered nothing but silence, her desperation spiked. "Brenna is practically having a nervous breakdown," Elaine pleaded, her voice rising a full octave. "Tyler is talking about filing for bankruptcy. And Leon is asking questions about the wedding that I simply cannot answer without looking like a complete fool. Please, Savannah, we are still a family. You have made your point. If you just call off your attack dog and drop the lawsuit, we can sit down at the dining table and figure out a fair way to divide things up so everyone can move on in peace." She was still doing it. Even now, with the entire structure of their deceit burning to the ground around her, she was trying to manipulate the narrative. She was trying to frame my pursuit of legal justice as a petty, vindictive attack that I needed to call off just to save her precious social calendar and keep her new fiancé from walking away. "There is no table anymore. Mother, I replied, my voice as cold and flat as a sheet of winter ice. And there is absolutely nothing left to divide. If you or Brenna have anything further to say regarding my property, you can direct it entirely to Noah Pritchard. Do not call this number again. I disconnected the line and immediately blocked her contact. For the very first time in my 36 years of life, I established an absolute, impenetrable boundary. I was done allowing them to twist hard, objective facts into messy, weaponized emotions. I was done letting them dictate the terms of my reality. That afternoon, needing to escape the suffocating energy of the city and the endless barrage of legal emails, I drove my sedan up the winding, steep grade of Ravencrest Road. I parked on the gravel shoulder and walked up the stone pathway toward the black pine cabin. The air was crisp and completely still, carrying only the scent of pine needles and damp earth. I stepped onto the wide, wraparound wooden porch. For 18 months, I had felt like a trespasser in this space, a ghost haunting a property that the rest of the world insisted did not belong to me. I had carried the heavy, suffocating weight of an imposter, constantly looking over my shoulder, waiting to be evicted from my own memories by a family that refused to see me. But as I stood there now, running my bare hand along the rough-hewn cedar railing my father had built, that feeling of displacement entirely vanished. The wood felt incredibly solid beneath my boots. The property did not feel like a contested battlefield anymore. It felt like a fortress. The legal title was mathematically secure. The predators had been banished to the valley below, and the land was finally breathing a deep sigh of relief. I sat down in one of the heavy Adirondack chairs facing the dense tree line. It was a profound, intoxicating paradox. Up here on the mountain, the silence was absolute and completely peaceful. Yet, the deeper the quiet settled around me, the more acutely I could feel the catastrophic storm raging down in the city. The legal and financial machinery I had unleashed was methodically tearing my sister's life apart, brick by brick, dollar by dollar. It was a flawless, devastating ruination, and the most satisfying part of it all was that I could simply sit here on my porch, drinking in the crisp mountain air, without ever having to lift another finger to push her over the edge. When a narcissist is backed into a corner, they do not surrender. They rewrite the narrative. Brenna's back was against a wall of insurmountable debt and looming felony charges, so she resorted to the oldest tactic in the toxic family playbook. She played the absolute victim. Within 48 hours of my quiet afternoon on the mountain, a new, incredibly vicious rumor began circulating through our extended family network. Brenna was calling aunts, uncles, and cousins, weeping hysterically on the phone. She claimed that during those final, agonizing months of our father's life, I had not been a devoted caregiver. Instead, she painted a terrifying picture of me as a manipulative warden. She told everyone that I had deliberately isolated a dying, heavily medicated man, withholding his access to the rest of the family, and systematically brainwashing him into signing complex legal documents he did not understand. She explicitly told our relatives that my current lawsuit was just a vindictive, calculated revenge plot designed to bankrupt her and destroy our mother's happiness out of pure jealousy. It was a brilliant, disgusting maneuver because it weaponized my actual sacrifices. The late nights driving through blinding snowstorms, the thousands of hours managing his complex medications, the nights sleeping in vinyl hospital chairs, Brenna twisted all of my devotion into evidence of coercive control. And the truly terrifying part was that some of our relatives actually started to believe her. They were deeply uncomfortable with the harsh, procedural violence of the legal system I had unleashed, and Brenna's emotional, tear-soaked narrative offered them a much more digestible version of events. For the very first time since the night of the engagement party, I felt a dangerous, familiar flicker of self-doubt. This is exactly how the villains in my family always won. They transformed your own kindness into the very evidence they used to hang you. Then, my mother escalated the situation from a desperate family whisper campaign to a formal, documented legal defense strategy. Elaine drafted a lengthy, emotionally manipulative email and sent it directly to Leon Harrow, copying several senior members of our extended family. I only saw it because a guilt-ridden cousin quietly forwarded the message to my inbox. In the email, Elaine explicitly referred to the Juniper Ridge Trust as a tragic medical mistake. She claimed my father was completely out of his mind with terminal hypoxia and heavy painkillers during his final year. She aggressively asserted that he lacked the baseline cognitive capacity to execute a binding legal contract, framing herself as the protective, grieving matriarch who was simply trying to correct a sick man's delirious, medically induced error. When I brought the forwarded email into Noah Pritchard's office, his usual aggressive confidence dimmed slightly. We sat across from each other, the heavy trust binder resting on the desk between us. Noah ran a hand over his face and explained the brutal reality of probate litigation. While our documentary evidence regarding the chain of title was ironclad, Elaine and Brenna were actively steering the case into the murky, highly subjective waters of emotional manipulation. Noah warned me that if they formally challenged his testamentary capacity and alleged undue influence on my part, the judge would be forced to look past the wet ink on the trust pages. The upcoming hearing would devolve into a brutal, drawn-out battle of expensive expert medical witnesses, subpoenaed hospital records, and conflicting family testimonies. They would try to put my character on trial. Noah leaned forward and told me that without a completely independent, indisputable piece of evidence proving my father was of perfectly sound mind and acting on his own free will, they might successfully drag the entire trust into a legal gray area where judges often push for messy financial settlements just to clear the docket. We were staring down the barrel of a multi-year legal nightmare when my cell phone vibrated on the desk. It was Reese Talbot. I answered the call, my voice tight with exhaustion. Reese sounded out of breath, as if he had been sprinting. He told me he had just spent the last 2 days tearing apart his basement storage unit after hearing the ugly, fabricated rumors Brenna was spreading around Cedar Hollow. During his long career as a land surveyor, Reese routinely used a rugged, waterproof digital audio recorder to dictate field notes while walking remote property lines. He told me he had finally found the specific memory card from the summer he and my father mapped out the Raven Crest boundaries, just a few weeks before my father's heart condition became critical. Reese said there was something I needed to hear immediately, and he was driving straight to the law firm. 20 minutes later, we were gathered around Noah's desk. Reese plugged a small black digital device into the computer tower. He clicked a file, and a crackling, windswept audio recording filled the quiet office. At first, it was just the sound of heavy work boots crunching on gravel and the distant rustle of pine branches. Then, my father's voice cut through the static. It was raspy, but it was absolutely clear. It was completely devoid of any narcotic haze, confusion, or weakness. He was sharply discussing the exact longitude and latitude coordinates of the natural spring with Reese. Then, the conversation on the tape shifted. Reese's recorded voice asked my father why he was going through the immense trouble and legal expense of locking the land into an irrevocable trust, rather than just passing it through a standard will to keep things simple. My father let out a dry, bitter laugh that sent a chill straight down my spine. Because if I leave it floating in the general estate, Brenna will rip it apart before the dirt settles on my grave. His recorded voice echoed in the silent law office. She already got the life insurance policy payout last year to cover that failed restaurant venture of hers. She is not getting her hands on the mountain. She will just sell it to plug another hole in her sinking ship. Savannah is the only one who respects the foundation. I closed my eyes, the sound of his unwavering voice hitting me like a physical wave, washing away every single ounce of doubt my sister had managed to plant in my head. He knew. He had always known. But the recording was not over. The true, devastating twist was still waiting. Reese on the tape asked if Elaine was on board with such a restrictive trust arrangement. My father's tone turned entirely cold and exhausted. "Elaine knows exactly what I am doing," he stated clearly on the recording. "I showed her the completed binder on Tuesday. She hates it, but she knows I am right. She knows Brenna cannot be trusted with a physical asset, but she is too terrified of upsetting her favorite child to ever admit it out loud." The audio file clicked off. leaving a heavy, electrified silence in its wake. The betrayal was total. My mother was not a clueless, grieving widow who had been blindsided by a missing document. She had known about the trust before he even died. She knew exactly what his final wishes were, and she had still allowed Brenna to terrorize me, gaslight me, and attempt to steal my inheritance for 18 continuous months. Noah slowly leaned back in his leather chair, a slow, predatory grin spreading across his face. The deep concern over a messy, subjective capacity dispute vanished entirely from his eyes. He looked at Reese, formally requested the digital memory card to be entered into the legal chain of custody, and then turned his gaze to me. This was no longer a defensive maneuver to protect a piece of paper. This audio file was the silver bullet. Noah immediately began drafting the final exhibits for the upcoming evidentiary hearing. He told me that when we played that specific tape in open court, under oath, the entire facade would instantly vaporize. The upcoming hearing was no longer just about deciding who legally owned the cabin on the mountain. It was going to be the exact moment that the universe decided who in the Montgomery family would ever be allowed to keep their mask on, and who would be permanently exposed to the light. The heavy mahogany doors of the county courthouse swung shut, sealing us inside a room where emotional manipulation held absolutely no jurisdiction. The air conditioning hummed a low, sterile note, a stark contrast to the boiling tension radiating from the respondent's table. My sister sat perfectly upright in a conservative beige tailored dress, her hands clasped tightly in front of her. She had completely abandoned the arrogant, glittering persona she wore at the engagement party. Today, under the terrifying glare of a district court judge, Brenna was desperately trying to play the role of an overwhelmed, grieving daughter who had simply gotten lost in a maze of complex estate laws. When she took the witness stand, her voice trembled with a carefully manufactured vulnerability. She swore under penalty of perjury that she genuinely believed our father had revoked the trust years ago. She looked the judge directly in the eye and claimed that her rushed attempt to liquidate the mountain property was nothing more than an innocent, tragic paperwork misunderstanding born out of a desire to settle the estate fairly. Noah Pritchard did not raise his voice when he stood up for cross-examination. He simply walked over to the evidence cart and began handing her the physical proof of her own premeditation. He started with the printed emails she had sent to her discount real estate broker. He made her read her own words aloud, forcing her to publicly recite the late-night messages where she frantically demanded an accelerated timeline because the title history was going to be difficult to explain. Then, Noah laid down the United States Postal Service forwarding records, proving she had actively intercepted the county tax assessments merely 3 weeks after our father died. He followed that with the state registry logs, demonstrating that the notary stamp on her sworn affidavit was completely fraudulent. Finally, he introduced the financial ledgers. He systematically listed the $50,000 contractor deposit, the luxury vehicle order, and the commercial office lease. Noah leaned against the wooden podium, his eyes locked onto her pale face. He stated clearly that a confused, innocent person does not forge a public official's signature, reroute government mail, and spend nearly $1 million of phantom money in a frantic sprint to beat the title search. She had not made a mistake. She had executed a heist. Brenna's defense began to fracture, but it completely shattered when Miriam Holt took the stand. The senior underwriter sat in the witness chair with the absolute, rigid authority of a woman who destroyed fraudulent contracts for a living. Miriam clinically explained to the judge that a recorded memorandum of trust does not simply vanish or become legally void just because a family member wishes it to be so. She detailed the rigid protocols of title insurance, clarifying that any honest seller is legally obligated to declare potential ownership disputes before ever signing a warranty deed. By signing the purchase agreement while actively concealing the existence of the trust, Miriam testified, Brenna had crossed the line from gross negligence into intentional, documented real estate fraud. But the fatal, undeniable blow did not come from a lawyer or an underwriter. It came from the grave. When Noah submitted the digital audio file into evidence, the entire courtroom went dead silent. The judge clicked the playback button on his terminal. Suddenly, the raspy, unwavering voice of Grant Montgomery filled the high-ceilinged room. Every person present heard my father clearly state that the Black Pine cabin belonged exclusively to me. They heard him explicitly banish Brenna from the mountain, predicting with chilling accuracy that she would only use it to plug the holes of her own reckless financial failures. And then, the tape delivered the final revelation. My father's recorded voice confirmed that my mother, Elaine, knew everything. Sitting in the gallery just 2 rows behind me, Elaine completely panicked. The pristine, dignified matriarch facade she had maintained for 18 months dissolved into raw, ugly terror. She stood up right in the middle of the proceedings, her hands shaking wildly, interrupting the court. She began babbling, tears streaming down her face, trying to explain that she only wanted to keep her girls together. She cried out that she just wanted to keep the family intact, to prevent a war over a piece of wood and stone. But the judge banged his gavel, demanding order, and sharply asked her to clarify her statement. Trapped under the immense pressure of the room, Elaine finally cracked. She openly admitted to the court that while cleaning out my father's downstairs study the week after his funeral, she had found the heavy metal document box. She admitted that she had opened it, read the trust binder, and deliberately chose to hide it from me so Brenna would not throw a tantrum. A collective gasp echoed through the gallery, but the most profound reaction came from the man sitting directly next to her, Leon Harrow. My mother's immaculate, conflict-averse fiancé stood up slowly. He looked at Elaine as if he were staring at a complete stranger. He was a man who prized integrity and order above all else, and he had just realized he was weeks away from marrying a woman who actively conspired to steal her own daughter's inheritance. Without saying a word to her, Leon walked straight up to the wooden railing separating the gallery from the court floor. He flagged down the bailiff and handed over a polished, locked cedar box. He told the court that he had found it shoved deep into the back of Elaine's master bedroom closet while he was moving his tailored suits into her house the previous weekend. Noah Pritchard opened the box right there on the evidence table. Inside, resting perfectly preserved, was the original, wet ink Juniper Ridge irrevocable land trust packet, complete with the handwritten letter my father had addressed to me. The evidentiary hearing did not last much longer after that. The judge, thoroughly disgusted by the sheer scale of the deception, delivered a swift and merciless ruling. He declared the pending real estate transaction entirely null and void. He legally affirmed that I was the sole, uncontested beneficiary of the land trust, granting me immediate and absolute control over the property, the water rights, and the conservation easements. But he did not stop there. He formally referred the forged notary affidavit, the mail fraud evidence, and the perjury on the witness stand directly to the district attorney's office for separate, aggressive criminal and civil prosecution. The fallout in the courthouse hallway was a spectacular, rapid-fire collapse. Brenna had entirely lost her ability to charm her way out of the consequences. The discount real estate broker immediately served her with a countersuit for professional damages. The corporate developer's legal team approached her with a permanent injunction demanding full restitution for their lost opportunity costs. Tyler stood against the marble wall, his face buried in his hands, fully realizing that his company was dead and bankruptcy was the only remaining option. And down by the elevator banks, Leon Harrow quietly unclasped his expensive watch, handed Elaine her engagement ring back without a single word, and walked out of the building alone. I did not stay to watch them weep. I walked out into the bright, crisp afternoon sun, got into my car, and drove away from the wreckage they had built for themselves. 2 days later, I drove my sedan up the steep, winding grade of Ravencrest Road. I pulled up to the Black Pine cabin, cut the engine, and stepped out into the absolute silence of the mountain. There was no loud celebration. There was no champagne, no forced toasts, no audience to impress. There was just the steady, enduring presence of the ancient timber and the cold. Clean wind sweeping through the valley. The first thing I did was replace every single brass lock on the heavy oak doors. Then, I spent the afternoon kneeling on the wraparound deck, hammering fresh galvanized nails into the loose floorboards, securing the foundation just like my father had taught me. When the sun finally began to dip below the ridgeline, casting long golden shadows across the living room floor, I took the handwritten letter my father had left me, placed it inside a simple wooden frame, and hung it directly over the stone fireplace. I decided right then that this cabin would never be sold. Nor would it ever be a place for holiday gatherings filled with polite, toxic smiles. I was going to transform it into a private, peaceful retreat. It would be a sanctuary dedicated to truth, a quiet fortress standing high above the noise of the valley. As I sat in the heavy rocking chair, listening to the crackle of the newly lit fire, I took a deep breath of the pine-scented air. The shadow had finally lifted. This was my mountain now, and there was no longer anyone left who could use the word family to legitimize their greed. Thank you so much for listening to my story. Please let me know where you are listening from in the comments so we can interact and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Violet Revenge Stories channel, like the video, and support me further by hitting the hype button so this story can be heard by even more people.